Welcome to our latest Hippocratic Adventures interview. I am Dr. Shwini Bapat, and today we are very excited to have Dr. Kathleen McCann with us. She trained as a neurosurgeon, she did a postdoctoral fellowship in molecular biology, and she is now a COVID clinical researcher. So sit back, subscribe, and enjoy. Dr. Kathleen McCann, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us your story. How did you end up practicing in Ireland?
The very short version is a very long story. So the very short version is I married an Irishman. That's how I ended up here. And for better or worse, this is where we're at the moment. And now the pandemic. So since March 2020, I've been a clinical COVID researcher in St. Vincent's Hospital based in Dublin.
Wow. And so when did you graduate from residency, and what was your career path from residency kind of until now?
Very untraditional. So I would just skip right through that because most people would not have the breaks or the trajectory I took for a lot of reasons. So I think the thing would be a focus on is I ended up here now. And again, it's going to become relevant in a minute of, when we're talking about career paths, Ireland is not the place to go for a straightforward career path. Straightforward career paths aren't really something that's here. It's an incredibly convoluted system, and they'll kind of break down a little bit there. But finishing residency isn't kind of a thing here.
Okay.
So basically in Ireland, it's a consultancy system. So you finish medical school, you do an internship, minimum 2 years post that of basic specialist training, and then further specialist training, which could go on for anywhere up to 10 years, 15 years easily.
Wow.
Every place is a bottleneck. So you get an internship. After your internship, you have to apply again. After you do your 2 years, you have to apply again. And at each point, there's a bottleneck and more bottlenecks and more bottlenecks. Ireland has a physician shortage, but has no training places for physicians. Mm-hmm. So hospitals are staffed with huge amounts of doctors who have 10 years clinical experience, lots of training, but are not signed off for any career progress. After completing training, you're now in a second limbo. There's another bottleneck. Consultancy posts are appointed. So if there's no consultancy post, even though you finish your training, there's no job for you. You will continue on as a non-consultant limbo grade, and that can go on indefinitely.
And a consultant is kind of similar to an attending level?
It's not.
No?
It would be, but it would be. It'd be more of a thinking about the professor or head of department.
Okay. I see.
Because your non-consultant registrar working under a consultant could easily be someone who's in their 50s with 25 years experience. So it's really, they're still technically in supervised practice, and that's more of a political and legacy thing than actually a reflection of clinical competency. So, and again, if the post is there, and you apply for it, great. We do have young consultants. We have lots of consultants in their 30s. They got through it, but it's a little bit of a luck of the field, the opening, location. There's no guarantee you can be fully qualified, ready to go. But if the post isn't open, and again, the bottleneck again, you could be one post and 8 people for one post. Wow. Despite the fact that a waiting list, for example, for neurosurgery, I think there's something like fewer than 15 neurosurgeons in a country of 5 million people. Wow. Waiting list to see a neurosurgeon for a routine procedure for back pain, for example, in a public hospital could be up to 2 to 3 years. Wow. There are plenty of qualified neurosurgeons. They're not practicing in Ireland because there's no consultancy post for them. It's a completely broken system. Mm-hmm. The health service executive has not identified or funded another consultancy post. So you can train a neurosurgeon. They have nowhere to practice. They're just going to immigrate to a country that will employ them.
Wow. And so who determines how many posts are available? Clearly, it's not based on population and need.
It's not. And it's not. I mean, the other thing is that it's a public system.
Got it.
So, and so it's a public, it's socialist medicine, as Americans would describe as socialist medicine. And we do have a two-tier system. So socialist medicine, all of your academic posts are going to be in the public system. It's called the HSE, the Health Service Executive. And it is really messy because the training posts are a mixed agreement between your training bodies, the Royal College of Surgeons, Royal College of Physicians, and the HSE provides the actual funding for the post. It's really messy. The private hospitals, there is a private hospital, patients can have insurance or self-pay to have more rapid access to nicer hospital. The reality is you're probably going to get the same standard of care in both hospitals. One's nicer, shorter waiting list. And there are doctors who, if you're really committed to moving to Ireland, you're like, look, I'm just going to do this. You want to go through the red tape, and you have the capital to do the overhead. You can invest to set up a private practice in a private hospital. Hospitals, if you can meet, show that you can generate money for the hospital and pay, then there is a pathway. But again, a lot of young doctors, even though Irish doctors don't have the same kind of educational loans that Americans would have, a lot of young doctors wouldn't have that capital to invest, to pay for private suites, rooms, secretarial, all that. Even the malpractice, you're looking at the huge cost of private malpractice in Ireland. For a surgeon, especially spinal surgeons, you could be looking at $70,000 a year.
Wow.
Where if you're working in public practice, huge amount of that cost is subsidized as part of your contract with the health service executive.
Got it. Wow.
Yeah, it's a mess.
So for someone who is interested in transitioning to Ireland, what is the process of obtaining an Irish medical license?
What I'll do is I'll talk about the process, then I'm going to tell you the simplest hack to get around it.
Okay.
So to practice an Irish medical license, we refer to it here as registration. So it's a registration with the Irish Medical Council. For anyone who really wants to kind of go through and find out their eligibility, medicalcouncil.ie. Basically, it has an algorithm. You click on it, follows it through, and it'll tell you about your eligibility and what you would need to do. Most doctors who are watching, if you're American trained, you have an American medical license, you have a minimum of 3 years clinical training, you would be able to generate proof of that in some sort of way, especially finished training. You can walk through that process quite easily. There's two types of registration. One is general registration, basically says I'm a competent physician in good standing. A specialist training is a little harder to get when you train outside Ireland, not impossible. But basically saying when you come here, you want to practice as a specialist. So that's either your obs and gynae, your rheumatologist, your urologist, whatever. You want to practice in your field. You're going to get specialist registration. That process is a bit longer. Because you're trained outside of the European Union, your training is going to be individually reviewed. So you're going to submit, you're going to pay a fee, and the board is going to independently recognize your training. So yes, it's probably worth it, but you could be looking at a lag time of 6 to 8 months to have your specialist training recognized. And then of course the other things is, unless you're an EU citizen, if a lot of people, they have dual EU citizens, actually you walk in here fine, you're qualified to work. If you're strictly an American citizen or another nationality, you are going to need a work permit and visa, and be a lag time of a couple of months. I would say anyone who wants to come here, there is a gross doctor shortage. We desperately need doctors, especially emergency room physicians, primary care, women's health, and pediatrics. Now, when we say pediatrics, though, here, it is hospital pediatrics. Pediatricians here don't refer to the pediatrician's kind of routine well child visit type things in the States. That would be under family medicine, general practice in Ireland. So these are pediatric specialists. So pediatric hospital-based specialist care is needed. So if you want to come, you want to explore it, the simplest thing to do is actually, and it sounds crazy to an American, but it's actually use a locum agency. Locum agencies here, we have 2 of them. They are registered with the HSE. So basically you can go to them. They will walk you through the process. They'll walk you through the process of registering for tax. They'll walk you through the process of your Irish medical accounts registration. And they'll absolutely hold your hand every step of the way. So the 2 of them, if you want to explore, that is locumexpress.ie, globalmedics.ie. And that is the easiest way to get into Ireland, get a taste of it. They'll even find you 6 to 12 month contracts, get a taste of it before you commit. And if you do decide to commit, at that point, you've walked through the process in the easiest way. You've gotten some experience around the country before you commit to where you want to live. If you have some romantic ideas of practicing rural medicine in Ireland, the need is there. And if it really does suit you, great. But one of the things you might want to do is sign up with a locum agency and get a little bit of a tour around, because there's a lot of general practitioners. They need a locum to cover the maternity leave. They need a locum to cover some annual leave. But definitely hire 2 weeks out in the west of Galway. Gives you an idea of the different flavors of Ireland, and that might be a way to start. Even the negotiating, it's an incredibly bureaucratic process, but it's a good one. If you want, it is shared decision making with your patient. So you, in your space with your patient in a hospital or private practice, you decide your care plan. Insurance companies are not part of that. So if I'm in hospital practice, the management plan I want for my patient is what I can get for my patient based on logistics and availability. No one's going to tell me I can't have it from an insurance or pay point of view. So that can be really refreshing from one point of view. You're not going to find a lot of mid-levels. We don't have that huge PA, nurse practitioner. If you send a patient for a specialist opinion, it's going to be to another physician, and that's what you're going to get. So that can be really refreshing. And those kind of things that can really bog you down in America. I mean, here we do have electronic medical records. Mostly we hate it. So if you want to write in paper, no one's going to stop you. So if you're looking for a kind of a break from the worst parts of American medicine, it'll be here. The downside is that in American medicine, we really do put people on waiting lists by just telling them they can't pay for it, or have the insurance company deny it. So you don't have a long waiting list for the CT thorax because you either are getting it denied by insurance, or your patient's not even presenting to you because they can't afford it. In Ireland, with universal health care, everyone who's sick is there. So your limitation becomes triaging your patients based on availability. There's absolutely no way any healthcare system can do 700 CT thoraxes a day. So who gets it next? Who needs it most? So it's a different way. It's a different frustration practicing medicine. But again, it could be a bit more refreshing than having, than administrator keep telling you no, no, no. There's upsides and downsides.
Yeah.
But again, if you're definitely somebody who's doing a sabbatical, like you are going to take a gap year or at some point like this, and you're qualified, you want to take a break between residency and fellowship. I mean, 6 or 12 months here would definitely give you, might be something to against burnout.
Wow, that's great. And so it sounds like the pathway that you described, you don't have to take additional medical exams, and you don't have to repeat any part of residency or anything like that.
Now again, depends on what you're going to do.
Right.
And sorry, it's really loud outside my window here.
No worries.
So you don't have to repeat exams. Again, we're assuming the person there is American trained. And we're talking somebody who's coming from outside the EU and not American trained. Again, there is someone who doesn't speak English as a native language may be subject to having to take English language tests. If you're a physician who isn't from a recognized training program from further afield, then there is something called the PRES exam. But we'll assume for the purposes of this, talking to someone who's trained from US, Canada, UK, Australia, recognized programs.
And so even when you, let's say you transition into a locums position, would you work under supervision of some sort? Like, how do you get to know the flavor of how the system works?
I'd highly recommend, it sounds ridiculous, even if you're a fully trained hospital medicine person, I would say pick up a job as what we call here is like, say you're internal medicine, family medicine. I would pick up a job as a registrar, which is under supervision of a consultant. Okay. And just pick up a job like that, it requires only general medicine registration. It's an easy registration to get. You're going to be working under supervision, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because you're going to need a lot of help to navigate a foreign system. Yeah. everything looks different. Your CBC is an FBC. Every acronym is just that slightly bit different. There's lots of traditional Latin spelling, the O's and the A's, throw everybody stuck in there. And the hierarchies are a little bit different. And the patients are different. There are cultural nuances. I mean, I know that English is a dominant language here. Especially if you're in major city areas, it's the only language you're gonna hear. But there's a cultural nuance here to how patients would describe their symptoms, to how they expect their physician interaction to be, especially if you're going to go into primary care areas. And so it would be, so it's not a bad idea that if you have specialist training, you're fully qualified. Because I mean, quite honestly, your consultant, that ahead of you is still going to be somebody who would be equivalent to your professor head of department. And they're going to give you a scope of practice that you're competent to do. I mean, if you're attached to a gastrointestinal service and you say, look, I've done 4,000 scopes, and he's probably going to observe you do one. And then once he realizes you're slick-handed, he's going to turn the scope list over to you. And so, I mean, it is very much, each team is built along the skill set that it has. There's a lot of fluidity in the system, because there's no, with the exception of labeling an intern as a first year, SHO is 2-year, 2-3. After that, it becomes quite fluid based on a skill set of, rather than a PGY 4, PGY 5, PGY. It's not that kind of strict here.
And just to clarify,
you wouldn't see anybody qualified here with 3 years of residency at all. So everyone that you're going to be working with is going to be quite skilled.
And just to clarify, SHO is senior house officer.
Senior house officer, yeah.
Okay.
So what we would call a PGY 2 and a PGY 3.
Got it. And so how would you, it sounds like you would advise people who are approaching the job search to look through locums companies, because they really guide you through the process.
It's an easy way to do it. It's probably the most cost-effective way to do it. And it's a good way, because I mean, before you commit, because I mean, economically, you really have to take if you're American, you have to take a couple of really important things into consideration. One is your salary is going to be lower.
Okay.
Your cost of living is going to be higher. And if you have educational loans, that is not tax deductible here. So basically, to give you an idea of tax, is your first, you pay 20% on your first €33,000. After that, you're paying 40%.
Wow. Okay.
And yeah. So, and then on top of that, if you have to pay back out of your already taxed income, if you have to pay back educational loans, and your cost of living here is going to be much, much higher than would be in most areas of the United States.
Wow. Okay. So that's really important.
Yeah. So you really need to run the numbers on that, and budget-wise. The average salary, and locuming, if you're working a lot, you can expect to earn about €50 per hour. Is what with the standard rate.
€50 per hour.
50.
Wow.
Yes.
And that would be for like a general internist or a general
That would be a general internist. That would be as a medical registrar.
Wow.
Consultants locuming can earn around €90 an hour.
That's
and
low.
I mean, it is low. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I mean, you
won't
low. Even working pretty hard, you would expect to clear somewhere between 90 and 130,000 euro per annum. That's with, then you start doing some serious subtracting out of that.
Yeah. And are things like, it sounds like health insurance would be a benefit that's available to you and covered. You don't have to pay out of pocket for that.
You don't have to pay out of pocket if you avail of the public health service. Okay. So, basically anyone who shows up sick on the doorstep, they get treated. That's it. There's small co-pays, €100 copay if you present to the emergency room. Most doctors have private health insurance on top of that to avail of other services. But again, that's something I'd say that you could look at, and they can walk you through that as well. It's not necessary. It's just like, if you really want it. And, if you're moving over with a family, you definitely want to do some exploring. The educational system here is very different from America. It is fantastic. My 2 children are in it, but it's a bilingual education here. So children are both English and Irish speaking here.
Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah, so it is kind of cool, but to be aware that your child is already bilingual, say in Spanish, no one else. It's a bit different. Children start attending school here, and they would start mandatory education here starts at around 3,
Oh, wow.
and they start half days at 3, and so they are. They're just a little more advanced than we have in the States. So if your children are coming over here, not that they couldn't catch up. A lot of doctors would have their kids in really good schools to begin with, but there would be a bump and a definite cultural. And again, it's a different culture. It's not England. It's not the UK. And again, what I'm talking about is only applies to the Republic of Ireland. That's the lower 26 counties. Everything I've just talked about does not apply to the 6 counties to the north, which is a whole nother mess. Yeah.
And it sounds like malpractice insurance, if you work in the academic or in the public system, it would be at least subsidized or covered.
It's fully covered.
Okay.
Now, most doctors would take out the whole thing would be is that if something went wrong, you're covered, but it's to be the hospital policy. So most doctors would carry a very low cost supplement. And there's only one malpractice provider in Ireland. It's called Medical Protection Society. They're actually UK based, so we all have the same provider. And they will give you a quote for supplemental insurance, so that in case of something would happen, you would have your own representative representing your personal interests, and so the hospital doesn't throw you under the bus.
Oh, I see. And is it as litigious as as far as medical practice?
100%.
Okay. What have you enjoyed about living in Ireland?
Outdoors. The outdoors here is something else. I mean, it is extraordinary. My backdrop here, this is my local beach. And hiking is water sports. And it's not warm, it's rugged, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I can't say the scenery is something else from Kerry to Donegal. And so if you're into things like surfing, boating, yachting, hill walking, and sports is part of life here. So, I mean, one of the easiest ways to make friends here is if you're sporty dolls to join a local sports club. You'll find absolutely everything. It's a really outdoorsy, sporty country. And the other thing would be is that it is a very different culture here. It's an incredibly, it's just a lot less intense than it is back home in the States. Just a little less intense. You know, people wouldn't want to start a fight over politics. People tend to just do the best thing for people. Community is very important. Yes, we have, like right now it's COVID. We got a few crazy anti-vaxxers. Yes, Bill Gates is planning to sell the chips, but as a whole, we've had one of the fastest vaccine rollouts as soon as they were available. Our vaccine rollout was entirely due to supply. We couldn't get our hands on it. We're a tiny island, but once they were available, there was just, you know, we have had the fastest rollout. People just, it's my turn, up I go, roll up my sleeves, and no time for people saying, you know, yeah, we've got a few people like Bill Gates is planning his microchips, you know, but the majority of people here are quite literate, good educational system, and tend to be fairly decent humans. There doesn't seem to be an intensity of populist politics that have been a problem in many countries, not just America. If you look around, you know, the intensity of populist politics isn't really a problem here, and it's a very non-violent country. There are no guns in Ireland. If you're a trauma surgeon, you're out of luck. You're not going to find a gunshot wound here. We don't have guns. In fact, we don't have trauma surgery as a specialty here. If you're a road traffic accident, we don't have trauma surgeons. It's not even a specialty. So if you're trained as a trauma surgeon, you're going to end up attached to either an emergency medicine, which they'd love to have you down in a trauma bay. You're going to end up attached to an orthopedic thing. But when a trauma person comes in, it's kind of a multidisciplinary admission depending on what's injured. But yeah, it's not violent. The police here are called An Garda Síochána. They're not armed.
Wow, the police are not armed.
The police are not armed. No,
Wow.
Yeah. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what kind of cultural shift. Yeah.
What were some of the challenges that you encountered in transitioning to Ireland?
I think if you're used to the convenience of America, 24-hour Walmarts, next day Amazon delivery, and unlimited broadband no matter where you are, and roads that are straight. So the transitioning to everything is, you can expect everything to be a little less convenient, a little more expensive, and just not, if it's 10 o'clock on a Friday night, if you're not going to be able to go to a shop.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's it. I mean, who'd be working at 10 o'clock on a Friday night? And it's more a culture of who's going to work that, who's going to staff that.
Right.
And so it's not yes, we have Amazon, but basically your next day prime delivery is probably in 3 to 4 days. So so the convenience is what you're really going to miss. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just adjust your lifestyle. But if you're coming from if you're especially coming from a big city in America, where you can get anything you need 24/7 on demand instantaneously, it's going to slow things down a lot. Yeah.
Any advice that you have for someone who would be moving to Ireland?
Yeah, I think the thing would be is that there are lots of expat communities here. So I think reaching out. Usually, alumni clubs are really good, and there's a lot of them are linked. A lot of American universities have alumni programs here and student programs here, because they're constantly having kids through here, because Americans, unfortunately, we're not great with the second language. So a lot of study abroad programs are here in London because English. So there's a load of, so that's one way to reach out. You'll find a lot of expats, academics who are here doing leading study abroad programs, and they're kind of one way to link in and know somebody off the bat. Or the other way would be is the locum agency will actually try and hook you up with somebody. I think the thing you wouldn't mind is though, is that to kind of as a caveat, I think in my time here, I've only worked with maybe 6 or 7 other American doctors. Wow. And every single one of them has an Irish spouse or Irish parent that is a reason they're actually here. It's not the job. It's great. It's the job. You love your patients, but the reason to stay here is kind of family and personal reasons. So it's one of those things just to really, it might be fun for an adventure. For someone who can afford it, it might be fun, great 6 months. And as I said, I don't want to put anyone off it. Like, God knows Ireland desperately needs qualified physicians from anywhere. We won't be picky. They desperately need it. But the problem is that until they're willing to pay for it, right? And there's a real problem, unfortunately. But if anyone is financially able to just come here and work for 50 quid an hour, minus tax, it's a great job.
Right, and you get to go hiking and surfing, and
it's great, but it's beautiful and it's a wonderful way of life. But yeah, it's you're gonna be a long time paying off the student loans at that rate.
Yes, that is very true. Well, there you have it. Dr. Kathleen McCann, thank you so much for joining us.
You're really welcome.
Chatting with you. And to our viewers, until next time, remember, together we can dream beyond borders. Don't forget to subscribe, like, or post a comment.